Now, why would that be? Well, first of all, it's going to be a few years before the telecoms pick up. They have shot their wad for some years now. And the other is, what does it take to get a large number of users to higher bandwidth? What does it take to upgrade an infrastructure over a long period of time? And the answer is a long period of time. 10 years for upgrading this sort of infrastructure change. 10 years would be blindingly fast. And so my guess is that we're in the phase for home access that is going to be dominated more by fleshing out the service, making it more reliable, and making it more ubiquitous for internet access to the home than it will be for giving you very high bandwidth. See, it turns out that there's now fiber.
You want to be interrupted.
Okay, yes.
What about coaches and guys like that?
I didn't say that no one is going to be capable of doing it. The question is large-scale deployment. Because...
You guys heard of Cogent?
What was that?
Cogent.
Cogent could give you 100 megabytes to the door if there's fiber.
Right. See, there's fiber into your neighborhoods pretty regularly these days, and even that is not as ubiquitous as we might like to think. But folks might know the term the last mile, which referred to from the central office of the phone company to your home, and that's now sort of become the last 100 feet, because as they get fiber to your neighborhood, they don't have fiber to your home, because it's one thing to lay it down a street, and it's another thing to lay it into every single home. The cost of doing that is really enormous. And getting 100 megabits per second to your home is dandy, except that you're not going to have any mass market use of that. You're not going to have any vendors selling services that rely on that until you have a very large number of people who have that base available. Around 92, I saw a reference that said that the definition of a mass market is 2 million potential customers. Now, my wife teaches marketing, and she'd never heard that term, that number. And I don't know that it's the right number, but it feels like a good number. That's a large enough number that you're really into some interesting scaling for potential customers. And the importance of that number is going to show up shortly. Probably, if I had to think about it some more, I would guess that what we're going to see is a kind of digital divide in which there's the major mass market and then there's the high-end mass market. We don't have a whole lot of that right now, but the likelihood is that we will in the future. And so there'll be people with higher bandwidth or bandwidth at any time from all sorts of devices. We're getting the beginnings of that now. The 3G stuff that we're all expecting. Everything I'm hearing is it can't actually handle the capacities they're promising. So you can get very, very high bandwidth that no one else in your sector is using it. Well, that doesn't sound very good. Then there's a question of the size of the net. And at one point I was going to try to do the number of users versus the number of providers, but I decided just talking about users was enough. ARPANET, roughly 100 people. Maybe it was double that, but it's still a tiny number. By around the mid-70s, the ARPANET was a production environment, which caused problems because officially it was still a research network. And it would, in fact, occasionally be taken down to run a research project. And that became the impetus for later splitting the ARPANET between the research side and the military production side, which took place in 1983. Its growth stayed very constrained because it was a Department of Defense resource. You had to basically have a Department of Defense tie of some sort in order to get authorized to get on, and it was very expensive, very, very expensive. In 1975 dollars, I think it was $50,000 to attach. It was hugely expensive, and that's the attachment. That's not the yearly operation. And so there was an interesting digital divide then. If you were a top-tier academic environment or research house, you were on the net. and if you were the rest of the world, you weren't. And that created some very big disparities in what people knew about and understood about data communications, but also collaboration between universities. Because once one part of the university was attached, then all of it could be under the same permission. The growth rate stayed just fine, although it was not all that fast. The estimate I heard is that the internet doubled every 13 months, starting from its beginning, continuing through now. That's kind of astonishing. So when you hear about how explosive the growth of the internet is, well, it's actually the same statistics pretty much all along.
And never changed. It was smooth.
To my knowledge, that number that rate of growth has stayed the same. On the other hand, when you start with a big number, then doubling in 13 months gives you a really big number. And so the estimates I saw, and most of these estimates were wild-ass guesses. There was, in fact, no internet census. There were all sorts of attempts to guess. Some of them were actually pretty reasonable. And the guess was that around 93, we hit 2 million. And I have that bolded and in color because you'll recall, I think that's an interesting number for mass market. One would predict that somewhere around that time, we'd see a major change in the development and use of resources on the net in the early 90s. The estimates today we're in the ballpark of 100 million, although I've seen some estimates that are much lower than that. In 96, this is before we actually lived in Malaysia, I was on the eastern side of the peninsula, a town of 400,000 called Kuantan. And we were standing around waiting for the local sultan to show up. And they had various police around, and one police sergeant actually knew how to speak English, so he was chatting with us. Very friendly guy. The instant he found out I was involved with the internet, he said, "I want to sell your products." I didn't have any products. I didn't say I had any products. It just turns out Malaysians are extremely entrepreneurial. He didn't actually know anything about the internet. And in fact, at one point, it was really interesting. He said, "Now the internet, I know you have the internet in the US, but I'm not sure, was it invented in the US or was it invented in Malaysia?" And laughter is the usual reaction that I get when I say this to people. And it was certainly the reaction I had, although I didn't show it because that would have been rude. But then I thought about it a little harder, and I said, and I've decided that if you wanted to look for a measure of success for the diffusion of a new capability, you could not do better than having people think it was invented in their home place. It was that well ingrained. And in fact, about a week later, when I needed to connect into the internet, and getting an account with a local ISP in those days was really tough. It turned out there was a cyber cafe on Borneo where I was. And it had Chrome and fancy sandwiches and the whole bit. This was in 97. Yeah?
You said they didn't have cable, any sort of cable TV. How did they power cyber cafe? Was it going over phone lines?
Okay. How did they power the cyber cafe? And actually that raises, this is a more interesting question than you may even have guessed. The phone company resources were mediocre or poor. You could get a phone in your home. It was reasonably reliable. We actually found that we could get our cell phone working within about 4 hours of deciding to get it, whereas it took 2 weeks. But that may have been because it was the university doing the actual work. On the other hand, when it went out, it was another 2 weeks before it worked again. So the dial-up lines were the normal 9600 baud kind of stuff. I mean, don't even think about 56K over those phone wires. But you could get higher bandwidth into business locations if you paid for it. And did they pay for and in fact, actually, now that I say that, what they got was ISDN. So they'd have 1 or 2 channels of ISDN. So 128K, or maybe they'd kick it up to 144 if they did it the fancy way. And you might go, well, that's terrible, but compared to nothing, it's great. And in fact, the other significant thing is that for much of the country, and I think I class Malaysia as a second world country. In the U.S., we have this peculiar sense of we only have the very top tier, and then everybody else is totally deprived, and it's just not right. They have actually a pretty good economy, huge middle class, a lot of infrastructure, fairly stable political environment, and those are not the things you'd say about a third world country. On the other hand, the situation had some fragility to it. The economic status of people was not as plush as in Singapore or the U.S. or lots of other places. So not everyone could get the internet to their home simply because they couldn't afford the PC, or they couldn't afford to tie up their phone line, or they might not even have one. And so, in fact, in much of the world, internet cafe structures are extremely helpful because they're a neighborhood or a community resource. And in the US, they haven't been all that successful, but in much of the rest of the world, they're incredibly successful because they are a place to bring that scarce resource of high bandwidth and, oh, by the way, expensive computers. Now, in those days, plugging your laptop in was the odd thing because they weren't designed for that. They were just, and when I walked in, I wanted to plug in my laptop, and the staff person freaked out, handed me to the owner. The owner was a travel agent who had been spending $500 a month on faxes, and a friend in the U.S. said, you know, if we could do email, it'd be real cheap. And it was. And he looked at that and he said, this looks like a business opportunity. And that's why he opened the cyber cafe. He decided that if it was that good for him, it would be that good for lots of others. I'll give you a related anecdote. No, I think I'll actually save that one.
Never heard of DHCP though. I configured TCP/IP.
DHCP is in some of these places. I haven't been to a huge number, but I've been to a few trying to plug in a laptop. And I'm now discovering that frequently, but not always, cyber cafes or internet cafes can handle the idea of a laptop. Most of the time they don't do DHCP because it really isn't their business model. And they want more control over who plugs in. In Cusco, in Peru, the university actually ran a commercial cyber cafe with this incredibly old Cisco router. And I asked them in my extremely broken Spanish why they didn't use DHCP, and they pointed at the box, and the box was like half the size needed for the extra code, and they couldn't afford the change. Okay, so if we have 100 million now, I'm going to roughly guess that by 2010 will be roughly half the population of the world will have some internet access. I actually don't think that's a very interesting number because we are largely. Could you do me a favor? Yeah. Water, please. Yeah. Sorry. We are largely already at the level of global mass market. And we are already at the level where families around the world use the internet as a means of maintaining family ties. There's been a little of that going on for a few years already, and it's become really quite common. I remember actually meeting an Alsatian dentist who had just retired, who had reestablished contact with family in Texas and California through the internet. And he lost touch with them. This was just a few years ago. He had lost touch with them as a result of the spreading of people from World War II. So it had been that long, and he was able through the internet to obtain contact. And so going up to 3 billion is going to be real important in terms of continuing to make money and